The Southern African Development Community's extraordinary meeting will be taking place today in Harare in Zimbabwe. The summit is set to review the security situation in the region with the focus on the Democratic Republic of Congo and the post-election turmoil in Mozambique, among other regional issues. For more on this, we are now joined by NewsHawks editor Dumisani Muleya. Dumisani, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. So when we spoke to one of the representatives from SADC a couple of weeks ago, he indicated that, listen, that this is an ordinary meeting that is taking place. It is a scheduled meeting that is taking place. Yes, there's concern around what is happening in Mozambique, and it may form part of the agenda. Is it known if indeed this will be part of the agenda, the post-election Mozambique violence?
Yes, it is known that it is going to be part of the agenda, although the SADC Secretariat and officials, they are emphasizing the DRC situation. But the reality is that when you speak to officials behind the scenes, that is both the Zimbabwean officials who are currently chairing SADC and the officials from SADC headquarters in Gaborone, Botswana, it is very clear that the real agenda is Mozambique. It's not DRC. DRC is always consistently on SADC meetings agendas all the time. So there wouldn't have been an extraordinary summit to discuss DRC when it is always all the time on the SADC agenda. So when you look at it, it's Mozambique, which is the main issue. And of course, taking into consideration events, recent events in Botswana, and also the upcoming elections on 27 November in Namibia. There's also in the background the issue of Mauritius as well, because they held the elections 10 days ago, and there was a major development just like in Botswana.
Yeah, so a lot of election-related topics that are on the agenda for SADC. But if you focus on the one in Mozambique, and also asking this question in relation to how SADC was accused of not really dealing with the issues that were highlighted in the Zimbabwean elections, with the observers there also highlighting issues, including the European Union's electoral observer mission. And then remember that there was that SADC report, and later on the report itself changed about what happened in Zimbabwe. What's the difficult task that SADC faces now as it deals with this particular turmoil that is playing out in Mozambique?
Yeah, it's a very difficult task, and the irony is that, as you have just pointed out in your background, the irony is that SADC, when it observed the Zimbabwe's elections in August last year, the SADC Troika of the Organ on Politics, Defense and Security, which was then chaired by Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema, they found out the Zimbabwean election was not conducted, to use that diplomatic language, which of course I would then qualify. It was not conducted in terms of the Zimbabwean constitution and in terms of the SADC guidelines governing the conduct of democratic elections in the region. In short, they were basically saying those elections were fraudulent and rigged. That report led to a series of events thereafter. There was an extraordinary meeting of the Council of Ministers meeting in Lusaka after that report by SADC. And then thereafter, there was an extraordinary meeting that was held in Luanda to discuss that issue. SADC never withdrew that report. And then, of course, Zimbabwe tried to use its opportunity to take over SADC in August, as President Emmerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe became the chairman right now, which is why the extraordinary meeting is happening in Harare now. He tried to make sure that the report was withdrawn, it was revised, but that did not happen. What then SADC did was that they just said, okay, let's say all the elections that were held prior to the SADC meeting that was held in mid-August in Harare, they were peaceful elections. They did not go into the detail, which basically means that as we sit here, SADC is not withdrawn its report that the Zimbabwean election was not conducted in a manner that was consistent with the constitution of the country and the rules of SADC itself, basically meaning it was a fraudulent election. So there we're sitting here now. Mnangagwa is now the chairman of SADC. He has called an extraordinary summit primarily because of Mozambique. Because remember, there is the issue in the background of liberation movements that are on the decline, they are on the retreat, they're being defeated across the region. We've just seen in Botswana a landslide by the umbrella for democratic change led by now the new president, Dumaboko, defeating the Botswana Democratic Party, which was 58 years in power, and of course under former President Mokgweetsi. Now prior to that, there was the South African situation where the ANC catastrophically declined 57 to 40%. Prior to that, there have been many other changes in the region with the opposition parties on the rise, liberation movements on the retreat. And of course, now one of the reasons why there is Namibia in the background in this meeting being held today in Zimbabwe is because there is fear among liberation movements. They have their own organization, Liberation Movements of Southern Africa, that another liberation movement might actually fall next month in Namibia. That is SWAPO. SWAPO is a new candidate there. Netumbo Nandi Ndaitwa. She's a first timer. She's coming in there against an opposition leader who is on the rise rather. Panduleni Itula is on the rise. So there is genuine fear that there might be a Botswana kind of situation in Namibia come next month. So those are some of the underlying currents of the meeting in Harare. But the most immediate one, as you were pointing out earlier, is Mozambique, because the situation is becoming increasingly ungovernable. Although the new leader there, Daniel Chapo, won by a huge margin, 71% to 20% for Valencia Mondlane. The problem is that Mondlane is quite a lot of influence on the social base and has made the country very difficult to govern. And that political and the security situation in Mozambique is beginning to affect the region, which is the logic behind the extraordinary meeting. For instance, the border town between South Africa and Mozambique, the Lebombo border post, for some weeks now, there was no business. Business was disrupted fundamentally, quite a lot. And then similarly to the eastern Zimbabwe, there is something called the Forbes border post between Zimbabwe and Mozambique. It was disrupted, trucks couldn't move. So the Beira corridor, which Zimbabwe relies on for 70% of its trade, it has been disrupted by those demonstrations. That is why primarily President Emmerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe had to call an extraordinary meeting because of the political and security situation in the region, which is extraordinary.
Yeah, so for SADC as well, there's a credibility issue that they face going into this particular meeting, especially when it comes to dealing with the elections. The history that you've painted now. And then on top of that, you have this issue where one of the allegations that have been made is that Zimbabweans were allowed to vote in Mozambique's elections. This is a point that has also been stressed by the then opposition leader in Botswana, Mr. Boko, who is now, of course, the president of Botswana. They had said that even in Botswana, ahead of the elections, that they had believed that Zimbabweans were allowed to register and participate in the elections. And the governing party, the previous governing party in Botswana, had disputed that. So they go into this meeting with varying views about what has happened in the Mozambican elections.
Yes, there are quite a lot of varying views, but there's regional concern. To pick on your point there, there's regional concern that the regime in Harare, that the ZANU-PF regime, is beginning to interfere in electoral affairs of neighboring countries with an intention to try to entrench liberation movements or former liberation movements or parties of independence that are under threat. We saw during the South African elections. ZANU-PF, for the first time, it was overtly involved in South African elections, sending people to try to help the ANC to campaign. We saw even some of the ANC officials now singing some ZANU-PF songs during campaigns. I remember in the East Rand, Tokyo Squale singing some ZANU songs, liberation struggle song. And the cooperation between the ANC and ZANU-PF, it was very overt. But behind the scenes, it was much more deeper than that. There was quite a lot of exchange, not just of ideas, strategies, tactics, but there was a lot of exchange of resources. There was some money that flew from Harare to Pretoria in order to try to help the ANC. Similarly, there were concerns that Zimbabwe was trying to interfere in the Botswana elections. Some of the issues you have referred to them there. The parties in Botswana, opposition parties under Boko, now president, made a lot of noise about it. Now, similarly, there is a lot of noise in Namibia that some people were involved in Zimbabwean elections, which elections they are never free and fair this side. They are always rigged. Presently, there was massive voter suppression that happened in broad daylight. In Namibia, the concern is that the company that supplied electoral materials for the Zimbabwean general elections in August last year, a South African company called Rainform, which works with one of the business associates or allies of President Mnangagwa here, is involved in the elections in Namibia. Rainform is involved in it. It was given a tender, it's supplied. So the problem that is there is that these companies, when they supply these electoral material, they then get involved in manipulation, printing in more ballots than necessary, supplying ballots in certain areas and not in other areas, like what happened in Zimbabwe. They get involved in the manipulation of election. And that is the concern Namibian political parties have right now, the opposition parties, that Zimbabweans, through Rainform and President Mnangagwa's allies, one of them, a guy called Wikne Usivayo, that they may get involved in a way to manipulate the elections in Namibia to help SWAPO, which they fear is under threat. Because remember what has happened in Namibia in recent years is that just like the ANC, SWAPO has been declining from around like the late president, Geingob, who died in February. His last electoral mandate declined from around 87% to 56%. So you can see that the current president of Namibia, Nongolo Mbumba, is not standing. So the vice president is the one who is standing, that is Nandi Ndaitwa. She's a new timer, and when the last president was around 56%. So it's going to be a very difficult election for her there. And that's why the SADC leaders, Mnangagwa particularly, because this is in self-interest, that ZANU-PF can see the winds of change blowing, they can feel them. They can feel that there is really change underway in the region. Particularly when you look back, just take a step back into 2020. An opposition leader swept into power in Seychelles. President, what's the name of the man? Kalawan Ramkalawani in Seychelles. He won against an incumbent in 2020. Thereafter, just in Lesotho, same Matekane is Revolution for Prosperity, another opposition party won elections. And then in Zambia, President Isilela and his opposition won elections in Zambia. And prior to that, again, there have been major attempts by the opposition in Zimbabwe to win elections.
Okay.
With the opposition,
unfortunately, we are running out of time. But truly appreciate the time that you've made for us to speak to us about this extraordinary summit that is taking place in Zimbabwe. Perhaps maybe a conversation that we can pick up at a later stage. That was NewsHawks editor Dumisani Muleya.